concern over violent video games.
Your equipment has been destroyed.
We must stop the glorification of violence in our society.
Living virtual lives as first-person shooters.
Blame those games for sparking mass shootings.
The gruesome and grisly video games.
That's where the real blame lies when it comes to mass shootings.
Shouldn't we also quit marketing murder as a game?
Hey everyone, welcome back to Bear It In Mind. This video is part of a series looking at the topic called Approaches in Psychology. Each of these approaches explains human behaviour from a different perspective. This video is specifically going to explore social learning theory. In our first video into social learning theory, we explored Bandura's famous Bobo doll studies. Do make sure to watch that video first, because this video is going to refer back to those studies to help you understand more about social learning theory. We're going to consider some of the key components of social learning theory that Bandura proposed about how observational learning happens, and as we do so, hopefully you'll see how relevant they are to you and me in our day-to-day life. And stick around towards the end where, as usual, we'll look at some questions to check your understanding of everything we've covered about social learning theory in this video. Let's dive in. Part of the process of learning behaviour through observation involves imitation. This is simply defined as copying the behaviour of others. In Bandura's studies, it's the children copying the behaviour of the adult. Now, related to imitation is modelling. If we're going to imitate behaviour, there needs to be a model who we imitate. Modelling is the demonstration of a specific behaviour that may be imitated by an observer. There are many potential influential role models for children out there in the world, ranging from their parents, teachers, friends, as well as sports stars, musicians, and particularly these days, social media influencers. In Bandura's study, the adult was the model for the children. Just to get some sense of how influential a role model can be, at the 2020 European football tournament, Cristiano Ronaldo, just before his interview, moved a Coca-Cola bottle away from the stand, encouraging people to drink water instead. The result of such a small action was that Coca-Cola's share price dropped by a staggering £2.8 billion. Individuals like Ronaldo, who are such prominent and influential role models, especially with their huge social media following, reflect the significance that role models have on our behaviour. Now, just because we observe a model doesn't mean that we're going to imitate that behaviour. One factor that affects imitation is identification. This is when an observer associates themselves with a role model and wants to be like the role model. People, and especially children, are more likely to identify and therefore imitate the behaviour of role models they are observing if they're of the same sex, they're of a similar age or older, they have a higher status or authority, they are friendly and likeable. Naturally, there is a quality or characteristic about the model that the child would like to possess, which motivates them to identify with them. For example, in Bandura's research we saw how much observation was influenced by whether or not the model was the same sex as the child. Remember how Bandura found that boys who observed a female model were more likely to simply sit on the Bobo doll without punching it, compared to boys who viewed a male model. This led Bandura to state that, quote, "The influence of models in promoting social learning is determined, in part, by the sex appropriateness of the model's behaviour." For a completely different example, on Strictly Come Dancing, Dan Walker received lots of positive comments from older dads who always felt too embarrassed and too tall to give dancing a go. But seeing Dan Walker give it a good try and embrace the challenge and fun of dancing, many identified with him and imitated his behaviour. For another example, consider most hair product adverts that you see. Here's one by L'Oreal involving a celebrity figure.
When my blonde is luminous, I feel luminous. That's why I choose Preference by L'Oreal.
People watching identify with them. Same sex, higher status, likeable, and so are more likely to imitate their behaviour. There is a quality or characteristic about the model that the viewer would like to possess,
and I'm worth it,
which motivates them to identify with them and buy the product. Vicarious reinforcement makes a distinction between direct and indirect learning. Direct learning is when it happens to us. For example, in the case of behaviourism and operant conditioning, whether we learn to be aggressive or not could be the result of being rewarded or punished when we are aggressive.
Bart, how could you shock your little sister? My finger slipped.
Social learning theory develops this further to how we can learn behaviour by observing the consequences of behaviours that happen to other people. Vicarious reinforcement is reinforcement which is not directly experienced by us, but occurs through observing someone else being reinforced or punished for a behaviour. For example, we saw this in Bandura's 1965 study with the adult model being rewarded or punished for their behaviour. The child who was observing this was not being rewarded or punished themselves, they were seeing the reward or punishment happen to the adult, and by observing this, learn the consequences too. We see this very powerfully in lots of different TV programmes, such as the popular children's show Paw Patrol. Paw Patrol, whenever you're in trouble. In one episode, a character is caught cheating in a running race by taking a shortcut. The consequence of this shortcut was that he fell off a cliff and lost the race. The lesson for young viewers was, remember, cheaters can never be winners. Now, just for any of you concerned viewers out there, that cheater was rescued when he fell off the cliff, but not in time to win the race. Paw Patrol, Paw Patrol. And there's an interesting side note here for you to consider. The concept of vicarious reinforcement has raised questions about films that include violence and aggression being rewarded and portrayed in a positive light, and particularly computer games where players and their peers are rewarded for aggressive and violent acts.
Shouldn't we also quit marketing murder as a game?
Now we come to an important contribution of Bandura which moves him away from simply the external environmental factors of behaviourism and firmly puts social learning theory more towards cognitive psychology. This is because it looks at how mental, cognitive factors are involved in learning. Mediational cognitive processes are cognitive factors, our thoughts, that influence learning, that come between stimulus and response. Just because we observe a model we identify with, a stimulus, still doesn't mean that we may imitate the behaviour, the response. Bandura stated that there are mediational cognitive processes that happen after the stimulus that affects our response. These are attention. Key to the process of observation and imitation is how much we pay attention to or take notice of the observed behaviour. There are so many things seeking our attention that we are only going to observe what we pay attention to and form an idea of in our mind. Then there's retention. Retention, or retaining, is about how well we hold what we have observed in our mind. In other words, how well do we remember it? We may pay attention to something, but not really remember the details of it enough to be able to imitate it later. Often when we observe something, we don't tend to imitate it there and then. We imitate it at some later time. So for imitation to happen, we need to remember what we observed. Then there's reproduction. This is about the factors that affect your ability to reproduce or imitate the behaviour ourselves. We might have observed the behaviour, but we might not imitate it because we lack the ability to do so. And then lastly, motivation. This is about whether we want to reproduce the behaviour we've observed. The consequences of imitating the behaviour, the potential rewards and punishments, are going to affect whether we reproduce it or not. So let's imagine that you're on TikTok and you come across these brilliant videos of someone explaining how to play your favourite song on the guitar. You thought you'd never be able to play that song because it's so difficult, but these TikTok videos make you think that you could actually do it. You watch the video really carefully and re-watch over and over again. In fact, you pay close attention to where they're holding the guitar, where they're placing the fingers on the strings, and you pull out your guitar, dust it down, and give it a go yourself, remembering how they were holding it and where they placed their fingers. You'd love to be able to play your favourite song for yourself, and you even see the number of views this video's got on TikTok, and you think to yourself whether you could start making content like that yourself. Notice with Bandura's emphasis on these mediational processes that occur between stimulus and response, that he sees people as being more active and involved in the learning process. This contrasts with the behaviourism's more passive stimulus and response. Bandura argues that we can think about our behaviours and weigh up the consequences of them. So now let's test your understanding of what we've covered about social learning theory in this video. A question is going to appear with a few seconds for you to pause the video before the answer appears. Here we go. Question 1. Which of the following is not a key feature of social learning theory? Question 2. Suggest 2 factors that would make it more likely for someone to identify with a role model. Question 3. The head teacher of a school is concerned about the poor behaviour of the Year 9 boys, particularly in terms of how they wear their uniform. Explain what is meant by vicarious reinforcement and suggest how the head teacher might use vicarious reinforcement in 2 different ways to improve the behaviour of these Year 9 boys. Question 4. What is meant by mediational cognitive processes? Question 5. How is social learning theory similar to the behaviourist approach and also different from the behaviourist approach? So now that you hopefully understand something of social learning theory, bear in mind how much your behaviour may be being influenced by the adverts we are bombarded with each day and tactics they are employing to influence us. And perhaps for a young person in your life, you are a role model to them. Take care of how you behave and what you show, because impressionable young minds may be watching and learning from you. For more on the other approaches in psychology, check out the link to the playlist in the description below. I hope you found this video helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.